I never thought that buying a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, would turn into the worst decision of my life. But that was before I met Patricia Hammond, the self-appointed queen of the Saguaro Springs Homeowners Association. My name is Quincy, and I work as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm downtown. I had saved for years to buy my dream home, a beautiful 3-bedroom Spanish-style house with terracotta tiles and a small but manageable front yard. The neighborhood seemed perfect when I first toured it back in March of last year. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, and friendly neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs. What I did not know was that Patricia Hammond lived 3 houses down from my new place, and she had made it her life's mission to enforce every single HOA rule with the fervor of a dictator running a small country. The first time I met Patricia was on moving day. I was directing the movers as they carried my couch through the front door when this woman in her early 50s marched up my driveway. She wore white capri pants, a floral blouse that looked like it cost more than my monthly car payment, and oversized sunglasses that covered half her face. Her blonde hair was cut in that signature Karen style, shorter in the back and longer in the front, perfectly styled despite the Arizona heat that had the rest of us sweating through our shirts. "Excuse me," she said, not bothering with pleasantries like introducing herself or welcoming me to the neighborhood. "Are you aware that the HOA regulations state that all moving activities must be completed between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays only?" I glanced at my watch. It was 10:30 on a Saturday morning. "I think we're good," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "It's the weekend, so I figured it would be less disruptive to the neighbors who work during the week." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Quincy." Quincy. "Mr. Quincy, I am Patricia Hammond, president of the Saguaro Springs HOA, and I need you to understand that we maintain very high standards in this community. I will let this slide since you are new, but going forward, I expect complete compliance with all association regulations." Before I could respond, she thrust a thick binder into my hands. "This is your copy of the HOA bylaws, rules, and regulations. I suggest you familiarize yourself with them immediately. Your property is now subject to regular inspections, and any violations will result in fines." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there with a binder that had to weigh at least 5 pounds. My neighbor from across the street, an older gentleman named Frank, walked over and shook his head. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with a sympathetic smile. "Patricia is something else. My advice: keep your head down and do not give her any ammunition. She lives for this stuff." I thanked him and went back to unpacking, but Patricia's words stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I did my best to settle in without causing any issues. I kept my lawn trimmed to the exact height specified in the bylaws, made sure my trash cans were not visible from the street except on collection days, and even repainted my mailbox to match the approved color scheme. I thought I was doing everything right. That delusion lasted exactly 6 weeks. It started with a letter in my mailbox, official HOA letterhead and everything. The subject line read, "Notice of violation." My heart sank as I opened it and read the contents. Apparently, my front yard desert landscaping, which had been installed by the previous owner and looked identical to half the other yards on the block, was in violation of the HOA's aesthetic standards. Patricia claimed that the arrangement of rocks and cacti created an unbalanced visual appearance, and demanded I hire a professional landscaper to correct the issue within 30 days or face a $500 fine. I read the letter 3 times, certain I was missing something. The landscaping was fine. It was actually quite nice, with native plants that required minimal water and maintenance. I walked up and down the street that evening, looking at other yards, and confirmed that at least 8 other properties had similar or even more elaborate desert landscaping. None of them had received violation notices. The next morning, I drove to Patricia's house to discuss the issue like a reasonable adult. She answered the door with that same forced smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Quincy, what can I do for you?" "I got your letter about the landscaping," I said, holding up the notice. "I was hoping we could talk about it because I am a little confused. The landscaping looks just like several other properties in the neighborhood. Those properties are in compliance. Yours is not. But how? What specifically is wrong with it?" Patricia crossed her arms. "As I stated in the letter, the arrangement creates an unbalanced visual appearance. The HOA board has determined it requires correction. Can I see the specific regulation that defines what an unbalanced visual appearance is?" "Because I read through the entire binder you gave me, and I could not find anything that specific." Her expression hardened. "The board has discretion to make determinations on aesthetic matters. That discretion is outlined in Section 12, subsection 4, paragraph B of the bylaws. If you refuse to comply, the fine will be assessed and legal action may be pursued." I realized then that this was not about the landscaping at all. This was about control. Patricia wanted me to know that she was in charge, and I was expected to fall in line without question. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I will have someone come look at it." Over the next week, I contacted 3 different landscaping companies. All 3 told me essentially the same thing. My yard looked great and there was nothing wrong with it. One guy even laughed and said, "Let me guess. Patricia Hammond sent you the notice." Apparently, I was not the first person she had targeted with frivolous violations. I ended up moving a few rocks around and trimming one of the cacti, taking pictures to document the changes. I submitted a formal response to the HOA board with the photos, a detailed explanation of the modifications, and citations to the relevant bylaws that I believed my property now fully satisfied. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I got another violation notice. This time, Patricia claimed that my garage door had been left open for more than 2 hours on a weekday afternoon, which violated the community's security standards. The fine was $250. The problem was, I had been at work all day that day, and my garage door had definitely been closed. I even checked the timestamp on my security camera footage, which clearly showed the garage door shut the entire day. I sent the security footage to the HOA board, along with a strongly worded letter explaining that the violation was completely fabricated. I also requested a formal hearing to address what I called a pattern of harassment by the HOA president. That was apparently the wrong move. The harassment escalated immediately. Over the next 3 months, I received violation notices for everything imaginable. My trash can was supposedly visible from the street at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, even though collection was the next morning, and the bylaws specifically allowed cans to be put out the evening before. My car was allegedly parked on the street overnight, violating parking regulations, despite the fact that it was in my garage. I received a notice claiming my front porch light was the wrong color temperature, making my property an eyesore. Another notice said I had placed decorative items in my front yard without board approval, referring to a small ceramic pot with flowers that had been there when I bought the house. Every notice came with a fine ranging from $100 to $500. I disputed every single one, providing photographic evidence, witness statements from neighbors, and detailed references to the actual HOA bylaws that proved I was in compliance. The board would sometimes waive the fines, but Patricia always found new violations to cite. It became clear that she was not going to stop until she drove me out of the neighborhood or bankrupted me with legal fees. I tried talking to other board members, but Patricia had stacked the board with her friends and allies. There was Carol, her yoga buddy who always voted with Patricia. There was Richard, a retired accountant who seemed afraid to contradict Patricia on anything. And there was Susan, who I later learned was Patricia's cousin. The whole board was essentially Patricia's personal rubber stamp committee. By September, I had accumulated over $4,000 in disputed fines. The HOA sent me a letter threatening to place a lien on my property if I did not pay. I consulted with a real estate attorney, who told me that while the fines were clearly bogus, fighting them in court would cost me more than just paying. The HOA had deeper pockets than I did, and they could drag out litigation for years. His advice was to either pay the fines and keep my head down, or sell the house and move somewhere else. I was furious. I had done nothing wrong. I had followed every rule, maintained my property beautifully, and been a good neighbor. But Patricia Hammond had decided I was her enemy, and she was using her position in the HOA to make my life miserable. That was when I decided to do some digging. I am a financial analyst by trade, which means I know how to research companies, track down financial records, and spot red flags in accounting statements. I started by pulling public records for Patricia's address. Property records, mortgage information, tax assessments, all the usual stuff. What I found was interesting. Patricia's house, a large 2-story property with a pool and professionally landscaped yard, was mortgaged to the hilt. She had taken out a home equity line of credit 3 years ago for $250,000, which she apparently used to fund renovations and her luxury lifestyle. Based on property values in the area, her house was worth maybe $500,000, which meant she had very little equity. Her original mortgage, combined with the home equity loan, left her underwater if property values dipped even slightly. But the really interesting part was the home equity loan itself. It was held by Desert Valley Credit Union, a small local bank that I knew had been struggling financially. I had actually analyzed their parent company a few months earlier for a potential investment, and I remembered seeing that they had a large portfolio of risky home equity loans that were not performing well. I made some calls. One of my contacts at a competing bank told me that Desert Valley Credit Union was quietly selling off portions of their loan portfolio to raise cash and improve their balance sheet. Apparently, they were offering significant discounts to investors willing to buy the loans in bulk. An idea started forming in my mind. It was risky, maybe even crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. If I could buy Patricia's mortgage, I would have leverage over her. Real leverage, not just HOA politics. I spent the next 2 weeks doing my homework. I researched mortgage assignments, loan servicing, and the legal process for calling a loan due. In Arizona, most home equity lines of credit include what is called a demand provision, which allows the lender to call the entire loan due immediately under certain circumstances. It is not commonly used, but it is perfectly legal. I also discovered that Patricia had been late on several of her loan payments over the past year. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to put her in technical default under the terms of her loan agreement. If I owned that loan, I would have the legal right to demand full payment immediately. The question was whether I could actually buy the loan. I am not a bank or an institutional investor. But as I learned from talking to a loan broker I knew, There was no law saying an individual could not purchase a mortgage, especially if the bank was motivated to sell. I put together a proposal. I would offer Desert Valley Credit Union 70 cents on the dollar for Patricia's home equity loan, which was currently valued at $230,000 after 3 years of interest and minimal principal payments. That meant I would pay $161,000 in cash for a loan that was legally worth $230,000. The bank would take a loss, but they would get cash immediately and remove a risky loan from their books. It was the kind of deal distressed lenders made all the time. The hard part was coming up with the cash. I had savings, but not that much. However, I did have equity in my own house, plus investments and a retirement account. I could take out a home equity loan myself, liquidate some stocks, and borrow against my 401k. It would basically wipe out my financial cushion, but if this worked, it would be worth it. I scheduled a meeting with a loan officer at Desert Valley Credit Union and made my pitch. I explained that I was a local investor looking to purchase a performing loan at a discount. I did not mention that the loan was Patricia Hammond's or that I had any personal connection to the property. I presented myself as a purely financial buyer looking for a good return on investment. The loan officer seemed skeptical at first, but when I showed up with proof of funds and a cashier's check ready to go, his tune changed. He said he would have to get approval from his manager, which could take a few days. I told him I needed an answer by the end of the week, or I would take my business elsewhere. 3 days later, I got a call. Desert Valley Credit Union was willing to sell me the loan for 75 cents on the dollar, slightly higher than my initial offer. That put the purchase price at $172,500. I negotiated for about 10 minutes and got them down to $168,000. We had a deal. The closing process took another 2 weeks, during which time I could barely sleep. I kept imagining everything that could go wrong. What if Patricia found out and paid off her loan before the sale went through? What if the bank changed their mind? What if I was making a terrible financial decision that would ruin me? But on October 15th, I walked out of a title company office as the legal owner of Patricia Hammond's home equity line of credit. I held the promissory note, the mortgage documents, and full servicing rights to the loan. Patricia had no idea that her lender had changed. She would keep making her monthly payments, which would now come directly to me. For the first few days, I did not do anything. I just sat with the knowledge that I now held tremendous power over the woman who had been making my life hell for months. It was tempting to call the loan due immediately, but I wanted to be strategic about this. I needed to time it right. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, when I received yet another violation notice from Patricia. This one claimed that I had failed to properly maintain my front yard, resulting in an overgrowth of weeds that violated community standards. The fine was $800, the largest yet. I walked outside and stared at my front yard, which was immaculate. There was not a single weed. My landscaper had been there just 3 days earlier. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. I called a real estate attorney who specialized in loan servicing and foreclosure work. I explained the situation and asked what my options were. If she is in default under the loan terms, you have the right to accelerate the loan and demand full payment, he said. Based on what you have told me about her payment history and financial situation, you have grounds to call it due, but you need to follow the proper legal process. Send a formal notice of default, give her the required cure period under Arizona law, and then if she does not pay, you can initiate foreclosure proceedings. How long does the cure period last? Typically 30 days, but you should check the specific loan documents. I reviewed Patricia's loan agreement that evening. Sure enough, there was a clause allowing the lender to declare the loan in default if payments were more than 30 days late, and another clause allowing the lender to call the entire loan due if the borrower was in default. Patricia had been late on 3 payments in the past year, and one of those payments had been over 30 days late. That was enough. I drafted a formal notice of default and acceleration. The letter informed Patricia that due to her history of late payments, the entire balance of her home equity loan, currently standing at $228,000, was immediately due and payable. She had 30 days to pay the full amount or face foreclosure proceedings. I sent the letter via certified mail and email to make sure she received it. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I answered, and Patricia's voice came through, shrill and panicked. "What the hell is this?" she shouted. "What kind of scam are you trying to pull?" "Hello, Patricia," I said calmly. "I assume you received my letter. You cannot own my mortgage. This is fraud. I am calling the police." "I assure you it is not fraud. I legally purchased your loan from Desert Valley Credit Union. All the paperwork is in order. You are welcome to verify it with the bank. This is because of the HOA, is not it? This is retaliation. Actually, this is just business. You have a loan, and that loan is now due. You have 30 days to pay the full balance, or I will begin foreclosure proceedings. You cannot do this." "I will fight you. You can certainly try," I said. "But I recommend you speak with a real estate attorney first. They will tell you that everything I am doing is completely legal. You signed the loan documents, Patricia. You agreed to the terms. And those terms give me the right to call the loan due if you have been in default, which you have." She sputtered something incomprehensible and hung up. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. I had just declared war on Patricia Hammond, and there was no going back now. Over the next week, I heard nothing from Patricia. No more violation notices arrived in my mailbox. No angry phone calls. It was eerily quiet. I knew she was probably meeting with attorneys, trying to find a way out of this situation. But the reality was, she owed $228,000, and she had 30 days to come up with that money or lose her house. About 2 weeks into the 30-day cure period, Patricia sent me an email. It was notably different in tone from her previous communications. She asked if we could meet to discuss a resolution. She suggested that perhaps there had been misunderstandings on both sides, and that we could work together to find a solution that benefited everyone. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in a neutral part of town. When I arrived, Patricia was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked like she had aged 5 years in 2 weeks. Her hair was not as perfectly styled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as I sat down. Her voice was subdued, none of the usual aggressive confidence. "Of course. I want to apologize for how I have treated you," she began. "I realize that I have been unfair. The violation notices were excessive, and I should have been more welcoming when you moved into the neighborhood." I waited for her to continue. "I am asking you to reconsider calling my loan due. I cannot come up with that much money in 30 days. My house is my life. If I lose it, I lose everything. Then perhaps you should not have spent months harassing me with fraudulent HOA violations," I said evenly. Her jaw tightened. "I made mistakes, but does that really justify destroying my life? You were perfectly willing to destroy mine. You tried to fine me thousands of dollars for violations I never committed. You threatened to put a lien on my house. You made my life miserable for months because you enjoy having power over people. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. That was the question, was not it? What did I want? Revenge? Justice? I thought about it for a moment. I want you to resign from the HOA board, effective immediately, I said. I want a formal letter from the board waiving all fines and violations against my property. And I want you to leave me alone. No more harassment, no more violation notices, nothing. And if I do that, you will not foreclose on my house. If you do that, and you start making your loan payments on time every single month, then I will hold the loan without calling it due. But if you are even 1 day late on a payment, or if you cause me any more problems with the HOA, I will foreclose immediately. No second chances. Patricia stared at me, and I could see the calculations running through her head. She was trapped, and she knew it. Fine, she said finally. I will resign from the board. Today. What? I want your resignation letter submitted today. Send me a copy, she nodded slowly. Okay, today. We stood up, and I extended my hand. She looked at it for a moment before shaking it, her grip weak and reluctant. That evening, I received an email from Patricia with her resignation letter attached. It was brief and professional, stating that due to personal reasons, she was stepping down from her position as president of the Saguaro Springs HOA, effective immediately. A copy had been sent to all board members. 2 days later, I received another email from Richard, the board treasurer, informing me that all fines and violations against my property had been formally waived and removed from my account. My record was clean. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia would make her payments, stay out of my way, and we would coexist in the neighborhood without interacting. But I underestimated how much Patricia's identity was tied up in controlling the HOA. About 3 weeks after her resignation, I started hearing from neighbors that Patricia was telling people I had blackmailed her. She claimed I had fabricated evidence to force her off the board, and that I was running some kind of elaborate scheme to take over the HOA myself. It was nonsense, but some people believed her. I started getting cold looks from a few neighbors, people who had previously been friendly. I considered confronting Patricia about it, but I decided to let it go. Her credibility was already damaged, and most people in the neighborhood were actually relieved that she was no longer running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. Frank, my neighbor from across the street, told me that several people had approached him to say they were glad someone had finally stood up to Patricia. Patricia made her loan payment on time in November, then again in December. I started to think that maybe we had reached a stable equilibrium. She would keep paying, I would leave her alone, and life would go on. Then, in mid-January, I got a call from my bank. There had been a suspicious transaction on my account, someone trying to wire transfer a large sum of money using my information. The bank had flagged it as potential fraud and blocked the transaction. They asked if I had authorized a wire transfer of $80,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. I definitely had not. I immediately filed a police report and started investigating how someone could have gotten access to my banking information. It did not take long to figure it out. 2 weeks earlier, I had received an email that appeared to be from my bank, asking me to verify my account information due to a security update. I had clicked the link and entered my login credentials without thinking twice. It was a phishing scam, and I had fallen for it like an idiot. But here is the thing. I had not told anyone about that phishing email except one person. I had mentioned it in passing to Carol, Patricia's friend from the HOA board, when I ran into her at the grocery store. I had said something about how sophisticated these scams were getting, and how I almost fell for one that looked exactly like a real bank email. I had not actually fallen for it at that point. But the fact that someone tried to access my account just days after I mentioned the phishing email to Carol seemed like too much of a coincidence. I called the detective handling my case and explained my suspicion. He said he would look into it, but that it would be difficult to prove unless they could trace the transaction back to a specific person. I asked him to at least check if Patricia Hammond had any connection to the attempted wire transfer. A week later, the detective called me back. They had traced the IP address of the computer that attempted the wire transfer. It originated from a computer at Patricia's house. Moreover, when they searched her email account with a warrant, they found the phishing email had been sent from her personal computer using a spoofed address designed to look like my bank. Patricia Hammond had tried to steal $80,000 from me. The detective asked if I wanted to press charges. I said absolutely yes. This was not just HOA harassment anymore. This was wire fraud and identity theft, both serious federal crimes. The next day, 2 police officers showed up at Patricia's house and arrested her. I watched from my window as they put her in handcuffs and led her to their patrol car. Several neighbors came out to see what was happening. Patricia was screaming something about how this was all a setup, that I had framed her, but the evidence was overwhelming. The criminal case moved surprisingly fast. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that someone else must have used her computer, but forensic analysis showed that the phishing email was created using her login credentials, at a time when only she was home. Her fingerprints were on the keyboard. There was no reasonable doubt that she had done it. Faced with the evidence, Patricia eventually agreed to a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of identity theft. The prosecutor agreed to recommend a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, plus restitution for my legal fees and the cost of the investigation. The day of her sentencing, I sat in the courtroom gallery and watched as Patricia stood before the judge. She looked defeated, her shoulders slumped, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual expensive clothes. Her attorney made a statement about how she had been under tremendous stress, how she had made terrible decisions, and how she was deeply remorseful. The judge was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Hammond," the judge said, "you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position to help your neighbors, you used it to harass and intimidate someone who had done nothing wrong. When that person fought back using legal means, you escalated to criminal activity. You attempted to steal a substantial sum of money through fraud and deception. These are not the actions of someone under stress. These are the actions of someone who believes the rules do not apply to them." The judge sentenced her to the full 18 months in federal prison, plus the 3 years of supervised release and restitution. Patricia would also have to forfeit her position on any HOA board permanently as a condition of her release. As the bailiff led Patricia out of the courtroom, she looked back at me one last time. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just exhaustion and defeat. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. She had made my life hell, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. But another part of me just felt sad. This whole situation could have been avoided if Patricia had just been a decent person from the start. With Patricia in prison, her mortgage payments stopped. I waited the required 30 days, then began foreclosure proceedings on her house. Her husband, who I learned had been largely absent during all of this due to work travel, tried to negotiate a settlement, but he did not have the financial means to pay off the loan. The house went to foreclosure auction, and I bought it for $320,000, covering the outstanding loan balance plus costs. I sold the house 3 months later for $480,000, making a profit of about $90,000 after all expenses, and the money I had spent buying the original loan. It was not a fortune, but it more than covered all the legal fees and hassle I had endured over the past year. The Sagaro Springs HOA elected a new board after Patricia's resignation. The new president was a retired teacher named Margaret, who actually cared about the community rather than wielding power over people. One of her first acts was to reform the violation process, requiring photographic evidence for any citation and allowing homeowners to appeal violations to the full board rather than just the president. My life returned to normal. I kept my lawn trimmed, followed the reasonable HOA rules, and got to know my neighbors better. Frank from across the street became a good friend, and we started having monthly barbecues where people from the neighborhood would come over to hang out. It turned out that most people in Sagaro Springs were actually pretty great once Patricia was not around making everyone miserable. I thought a lot about what I had learned from the whole experience. The obvious lesson was that HOAs can be dangerous when run by petty tyrants who care more about control than community. But there was a deeper lesson too. When someone pushes you, you have to push back. Not with anger or emotion, but with strategy and leverage. I had used my skills as a financial analyst to find Patricia's weakness, and I had exploited it within the bounds of the law. It was not pretty, but it was effective. About 8 months after Patricia went to prison, I got a letter from her. It was forwarded through her attorney, and it was surprisingly introspective. She wrote about how she had been unhappy in her marriage, how she had felt powerless in other areas of her life, and how controlling the HOA had been her way of feeling important. She acknowledged that she had treated me terribly, and that she had no excuse for escalating to criminal activity. She said she was using her time in prison to reflect on her choices and to try to become a better person. I read the letter twice, and then filed it away. I appreciated the apology, but it did not change what had happened. Actions have consequences, and Patricia was living with hers. As for me, I learned to do my due diligence before buying a house in an HOA. I also learned that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but simply standing up for yourself and refusing to be pushed around. Patricia thought she could bully me out of the neighborhood or fine me into submission. Instead, she ended up in federal prison and lost everything. The funny thing is, if she had just left me alone from the beginning, none of this would have happened. I would have been a quiet, boring neighbor who followed the rules and never caused any problems. But she could not help herself. She had to push and push and push, until she finally pushed someone who pushed back harder. By the time spring rolled around, the neighborhood had moved on from the drama. New families moved in, including a young couple who bought Patricia's old house. They were friendly and normal, the kind of neighbors everyone hopes for. The HOA continued to function, now focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules. I sometimes drove past my house on my way home from work and marveled at how peaceful everything looked. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained properties, neighbors waving to each other as they walked their dogs. It was exactly what I had hoped for when I first moved to Sagaro Springs, before Patricia Hammond turned it into a nightmare. The whole experience changed me in ways I did not expect. I became more confident, more willing to stand up for myself when someone tried to take advantage of me. I also became more aware of the importance of community and how quickly it can be poisoned by one toxic person in a position of power. I stayed in touch with Frank and some of the other neighbors, and we would occasionally talk about the Patricia situation over beers in my backyard. Everyone had their own stories about her harassment, violations she had invented, fines she had threatened. One guy told me she had tried to fine him for having the wrong shade of brown on his mailbox, insisting it was too dark and violated the color standards. Another woman said Patricia had reported her to animal control for having a dog that barked too much. Even though the woman did not own a dog, it became clear that Patricia had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and I had just been the one who finally fought back. In a weird way, I became something of a neighborhood hero, though I never felt comfortable with that label. I had not set out to save the community from a tyrant. I had just wanted to live in peace. The legal system worked slowly but surely. Patricia served her full 18 months in federal prison at a facility in California. When she was released in June of the following year, she was required to live in a halfway house for 6 months as part of her supervised release. She was not allowed to return to Arizona during that period, and by the time her restrictions were lifted, her ex-husband had filed for divorce and sold all their remaining assets to pay off debts. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia ended up moving to somewhere in Colorado, taking a job as a receptionist at a medical office. The woman who had once ruled over our HOA with an iron fist was now just another person trying to rebuild her life after making catastrophic mistakes. As for the mortgage I had used as leverage, I eventually sold the loan servicing rights to another investor who specialized in performing home equity loans. I made a small profit on that transaction too, and I was glad to be done with the whole financial entanglement. I had never wanted to be in the mortgage business. I had just wanted Patricia to leave me alone. Looking back now, almost 2 years after I first moved to Saguaro Springs, I can see the whole arc of the story clearly. It started with a woman who confused authority with power, who thought that being HOA president gave her the right to control other people's lives. It escalated because she could not accept that someone was willing to stand up to her. And it ended with her in prison, and me finally getting the peaceful suburban life I had wanted all along. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, always read HOA bylaws before buying a house and pay attention to who runs the board. Second, document everything when dealing with unreasonable people because evidence matters. Third, use your skills and expertise to your advantage when someone tries to push you around. And fourth, sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to find their weakness and apply pressure legally and ethically until they back down. I also learned that communities are fragile things. One bad actor in a position of power can make life miserable for dozens of people. But communities are also resilient. Once Patricia was gone, Saguaro Springs became the friendly, welcoming neighborhood it should have been all along. People started organizing events again. Kids played in the streets, and neighbors actually talked to each other instead of worrying about violation notices. The new HOA board under Margaret's leadership was night and day different from Patricia's regime. They focused on actual community needs like organizing street repairs, negotiating better rates for neighborhood landscaping services, and planning social events. Violation notices were rare and only issued for legitimate problems like truly neglected properties or obvious safety hazards. It was what an HOA was supposed to be: a group of neighbors working together to maintain property values and quality of life, not a dictator's personal enforcement squad. I attended a few HOA meetings after everything settled down, mostly out of curiosity to see how things had changed. The difference was remarkable. Meetings were friendly and productive instead of tense and adversarial. People volunteered for committees and actually seemed to enjoy being involved. Margaret ran the meetings efficiently but democratically, making sure everyone had a chance to speak and vote. At one meeting, About a year after Patricia went to prison, someone proposed creating a fund to help homeowners who were struggling financially to keep up with property maintenance. The idea was that the HOA would provide low-interest loans or grants to help with necessary repairs, preventing the kind of desperate situation that had contributed to Patricia's downfall. The proposal passed unanimously, and I even contributed some money to the fund. It felt good to be part of a real community again, instead of living in fear of the next violation notice. I started inviting neighbors over for dinner, attending the block parties that Margaret organized, and generally being the kind of engaged resident I had always wanted to be. My career continued to progress well. The skills I had used to investigate Patricia and buy her mortgage actually helped me at work. My boss was impressed by my creative problem-solving and attention to detail, and I got a promotion to senior analyst with a significant raise. The financial hit I had taken to buy Patricia's loan was more than offset by my increased salary and the eventual profit from reselling her house. I even started dating someone I met at one of the neighborhood barbecues. Her name was Olivia Bradford, and she had moved to Saguaro Springs about 6 months after all the drama with Patricia ended. She had heard stories about what happened, but had not been there to experience it firsthand. We bonded over our shared love of hiking in the Arizona desert and our mutual appreciation for quiet suburban life. Olivia worked as a nurse at a hospital downtown, and she had her own stories about dealing with difficult people in high-stress situations. We would swap stories sometimes, her tales of demanding patience and mine about Patricia's reign of terror. It was therapeutic in a way, being able to laugh about it with someone who understood what it was like to deal with unreasonable people. About 18 months after Patricia went to prison, I got an unexpected phone call from her ex-husband, David. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I was hesitant, not knowing what he wanted, but curiosity got the better of me. David turned out to be a decent guy who had been largely oblivious to what Patricia was doing. He traveled constantly for work as a sales executive, and he had trusted Patricia to manage their home life. He had no idea she was harassing neighbors or committing wire fraud until the police showed up to arrest her. "I wanted to apologize," he said when we met. "I know I was not the one doing those things, but I feel responsible for not seeing what was happening. I should have paid more attention." "You could not have known," I said, meaning it. "Patricia was very good at presenting one face to you and another face to everyone else. Still, I am sorry for what you went through, and I wanted to thank you actually. Thank me for fighting back. Patricia needed someone to stand up to her. I could not do it. I was too afraid of confrontation, too willing to just keep the peace at home by letting her do whatever she wanted. But you did not back down, and maybe that will help her become a better person in the long run." We talked for another hour, and I learned more about Patricia's background. She had grown up in a chaotic household with an alcoholic father and an absent mother. Control had been her way of coping with the unpredictability of her childhood. She had carried that need for control into adulthood, and it had poisoned every relationship she had. David told me that Patricia was actually doing better in prison than he had expected. She had joined therapy groups, taken classes, and seemed genuinely committed to changing her behavior. He was not getting back together with her, he made that clear, but he hoped she could find some peace after she was released. I appreciated David's perspective, and it helped me let go of some of the anger I still carried. Patricia was not just a villain in my story. She was a flawed human being who had made terrible choices and was now paying the price. I could acknowledge that without excusing what she had done. As time went on, the Patricia Hammond saga became just another chapter in my life, not the defining story. I continued to thrive at work. My relationship with Olivia grew stronger, and the neighborhood remained peaceful and friendly. Life moved forward the way it was supposed to. I did make one significant change after everything that happened. I became much more active in the HOA. I joined the Architectural Review Committee and helped create clearer, more reasonable standards for property modifications. I wanted to make sure that what happened to me could not happen to someone else. The committee developed detailed guidelines with photographic examples of approved and non-approved modifications, taking away the subjective discretion that Patricia had abused. I also pushed for term limits on board positions, ensuring that no one person could dominate the HOA for years the way Patricia had. The new bylaws limited board members to 2 consecutive 2-year terms, after which they had to take at least a year off before running again. It was a common-sense reform that everyone supported. The neighborhood continued to improve. Property values went up as word spread that Saguaro Springs was a great place to live now that Patricia was gone. New families moved in, attracted by the friendly community and reasonable HOA. The local elementary school saw an increase in enrollment as more young families bought houses in the area. Frank from across the street became one of my closest friends. He was in his 70s, a retired engineer who had lived in Saguaro Springs for over 20 years. He had seen the neighborhood through different phases and different HOA boards, and he said the current board was the best it had been in decades. "You did a good thing," Frank told me one evening as we sat on his porch drinking iced tea. "Standing up to Patricia took guts. A lot of people just moved away rather than fight her." "I got lucky," I said. "If I had not found out about her financial situation, I would not have had any leverage." "Luck favors the prepared," Frank replied with a smile. "You did your homework, you found her weakness, and you used it ethically. That is not luck. That is smart." I thought about that conversation a lot. Had I been ethical in buying Patricia's mortgage and threatening foreclosure? It was a legal tactic, certainly, but was it moral? I had used financial pressure to force someone out of a position of power. In Patricia's case, it seemed justified because she was abusing that power. But what if someone used the same tactic against a good person who just happened to be in financial trouble? These were complicated questions, and I did not have easy answers. What I did know was that I had acted within the law. I had given Patricia opportunities to back down peacefully, and I had only escalated when she refused to stop harassing me. In the context of our specific situation, I felt comfortable with the choices I had made. As the second anniversary of moving to Saguaro Springs approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had happened in such a short time. I had gone from excited new homeowner to harassment victim to financial strategist to neighborhood hero, all in the span of about 18 months. It had been exhausting and stressful, but I had come out the other side stronger and more confident. Olivia and I were talking about moving in together, possibly buying a bigger house in the same neighborhood. The idea of staying in Saguaro Springs and building a life there felt right. This was my community now, for better or worse, and I was invested in making it a good place to live. The HOA held a neighborhood barbecue that summer, and almost every household attended. Kids played in the park while adults mingled and caught up on news. Margaret gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their continued involvement, and announcing that the neighborhood had won an award from the city for community improvement. It was a nice moment, seeing everyone come together without fear or tension. As I stood there with Olivia, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert and listening to neighbors laugh and talk, I felt genuinely content. This was what I had wanted when I bought my house. A peaceful place to live, surrounded by good people, in a community that functioned well. It had taken a fight to get here, and it had cost more than I expected in time, money, and stress. But it was worth it. Patricia Hammond taught me an important lesson, though not the one she intended. She taught me that bullies only have power if you let them. She thought her position as HOA president made her untouchable, that she could harass whoever she wanted without consequences. She was wrong. When confronted with someone who was willing to fight back strategically and persistently, her power crumbled. I never heard from Patricia again after her initial letter from prison. I hoped she had found some peace and was building a better life in Colorado. I bore her no ill will anymore. She had paid for her crimes, lost her home and her marriage, and spent 18 months in federal prison. That was punishment enough. As for me, I got exactly what I wanted from the beginning, a nice house in a good neighborhood where I could live in peace. It took a detour through HOA hell and financial warfare to get there, but I made it. And maybe that is the real lesson of this whole story. Sometimes you have to fight for the life you want, even when the fight seems unfair or overwhelming. Sometimes you have to use every skill and resource you have to defend yourself against people who think they can push you around. Patricia Hammond harassed me for months, tried to find me into submission, and eventually attempted to steal from me. In response, I bought her mortgage from the bank and called it due, forcing her to resign from the HOA and eventually leading to her arrest when she escalated to criminal activity. It was not the neighborhood welcome I had hoped for, but it taught me more about resilience, strategy, and community than any other experience in my life. And now, standing in my front yard on a warm Arizona evening, surrounded by friends and neighbors, living the peaceful suburban life I had always wanted, I could finally say that everything had worked out exactly as it should.